Hello, I'm Femi Oke.
And I'm Malika Bilal, and you're in the stream.
Former US President Jimmy Carter is with us today. He says it's time to hold government accountable for excessive and unwanted violence, especially in times of protests.
He's shifting the lens away from individuals and focusing on those in power.
Jimmy Carter, the 39th President of the United States, is back in the stream. Mr. President, it's great to have you back. Now, the timing for this. You have a regular at the Carter Center, a Human Rights Defender Forum. Last time we spoke to you, you were looking at women's rights around the world. This time, your theme is what, Mr. President?
Well, our theme this time is the problem that the world faces in having made violence the normal thing for people to expect from their own government and among governments as well. And of course, this violence means one of the violations of a basic human right of peace. So we are talking about the global move toward violence as a normal way of life. And obviously, one of the reasons that we have violence is because women and girls are basically excluded from the decision-making process. So these things all tie together. Is women's rights and women's involvement in making decisions, and the fact that governments, as a result probably of the 9/11 and subsequent terrorist threats, resorting to violence as a normal way of life.
Now, President Carter, of course, you know this, but for our online audience, there is a hashtag to follow along to hear what some of those sessions are like. It's time for peace. So we looked through that hashtag and we saw a tweet from Sita. It says this: I'm honored to be in conversation with activists helping communities unlearn violence. It equals a powerful vision for peace. President Carter, what are some of those conversations like?
Well, it's very difficult for people to unlearn what a commitment to violence means. When we say nonviolence, most often we are talking to individual people. When we know that the governments and police forces and people in authority basically adopt a certain standard of response to a crisis or to a serious problem. And we now have an abandonment of the commitments that were made back at the end of World War II when we decided to have the United Nations committed to what? Peace. And then subsequently we had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights committed to human rights. In effect, the world has abandoned both of these commitments to peace and to human rights. And in a small way, we at the Carter Center this week have been talking about how do we restore the leaders' commitment and the people's commitment to these two wonderful goals that all human beings ought to have.
President Carter, is it such a big issue, such a big theme to take in global violence and say, how do we stop this? How do we reduce this? Why did you pick such a huge theme for this year's forum? Is it even achievable?
We believe it's achievable. It has been achieved in the past. I just mentioned the aftermath of the Second World War, when the people around the world, including all the major leaders of major nations, met together in San Francisco in 1945 and we formed the United Nations. And the purpose of the United Nations, as expressed in its own bylaws, was peace. So whenever we faced a problem in a country or in between two countries, the United Nations would move in and orchestrate some means toward peace. But that's been abandoned. And then subsequent to that, we organized a commitment to a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and now human rights have been violated, basically because of a reaction recently to terrorism. So when the governments do this, of course, the people then respond accordingly. And I've mentioned also peace forces, police forces around this country and other places. And many countries, with the United States having lost its leadership in the move toward peace and human rights, other countries now breathe a sigh of relief and said, okay, we can punish or abuse our own people. That's what we're trying to address.
And now our international community has heard the impetus behind the forum and today's show. So you at home can now weigh in and get your questions answered by President Carter. All you have to do is use the hashtag AJStream.
On Sunday in Nochixtlan, a half-hour north of Oaxaca City, police opened fire.
It began as a peaceful protest, but police said the students didn't have permission to protest and tried to arrest the student union president. When other students refused to hand him over, there was violence.
After only a few hours, the security forces had had enough.
When tear gas wasn't enough to disperse the crowd, the riot police moved in.
You may no longer be in the area. It is no longer a peaceful protest.
In a matter of hours, the streets went from peaceful protest and calls for justice to scenes out of a conflict zone.
So as you've just seen, state crackdowns on peaceful demonstrations are regularly making news. To help us talk about this with President Carter, we're also joined by Reverend Tracy Blackman. She is the acting executive minister of the United Church of Christ, Justice and Witness Ministries, and she's from the U.S. state of Missouri. Felix Horn is a researcher at Human Rights Watch. His work focuses on the Horn of Africa. He's coming to us from Geneva, Switzerland. And in London, we have Ali Abdul Imam. He's a Bahraini blogger and human rights defender. It's good to have you, everybody, here in our conversation with President Carter.
You know, Femi, when we talk about protests, where we hear the most from, I would say among our community today, are people in Bahrain. This is a tweet we got from Bahraini citizen. He says, in Bahrain, for protesting peacefully, you could end up with bird-shot gun pellets shot at you from a close distance. Ali, I know that you were involved in protests at one time. Can you elaborate on this tweet and what that might feel like and why?
Well, it's only with the, it's not only with the bird shoot gun, it's also with the tear gas. This kind of weapon is used as a killing weapon instead of non-lethal weapons. But yeah, I've been experiencing many police brutality during my protest or the protests happening in Bahrain, and they don't use these kind of weapons just to distribute the gathering. They just use it as a collective punishment for the whole area, just to make more pressure on the people to don't allow the people to protest in front of the roads or in front of the villages.
So, Reverend, Ferguson was an international story as well as a big US domestic story. When you were watching the protests, what were you noticing in terms of police activity, how the police were treating people? Your parishioners are right there, your congregation is right there, very close.
There was a lot of anger, a lot of sadness, just overwhelming grief, and sometimes that grief would turn to rage. Mostly the feelings that you have when you feel that your issues and your concerns are not being heard, that you've been rendered invisible. And the way that those emotions were manifest in Ferguson varied for people. Lots of tears, lots of sadness, and for some, lots of rage and lots of fury.
What do you think the rest of the world, as they were watching, were learning from what was happening in Ferguson, President Carter?
Well, we learned a lot. And I say one of the things that America did learn again is that we have not solved the race issue in our country. We thought back when Martin Luther King Jr. was heroic in the civil rights movement, and Andy Young and many others. And then later when we passed the laws that did away with official racial discrimination, we kind of breathed a sigh of relief and said, now we've solved the race issue. But I think Ferguson and other places where the police have been overly abusive, particularly against African American citizens, that we realize we still have a long way to go. And it may be, I hope, it will be an awakening for us, and we'll correct some of these basic problems that have been so evident in the police mistreatment of African Americans and other minorities. One of the things we learned also from Ferguson was that although a majority of the citizens are African Americans, the overwhelming majority of the policemen were white people. So that's another lesson that we've learned. It applies to many other countries, and not only in other countries, but also in our country as well. So we don't single out other nations for condemnation here. I would say most of our criticism is focused on the United States as an example, and as one of the superpowers that affects other people with our own policies. So if we can correct our problems here in the United States, it'll send a wonderful a beneficial message to other countries as well who have serious problems.
You know, President Carter, I think our community would agree with you. And you talked about lessons learned. I want to share a few tweets that were pretty prominent not too long ago when Ferguson was really going off. This was a message from the people of Palestine to the people of Ferguson. And Reverend, I will direct these to you. Rana says, Hamdi Abu has a message. He tells Ferguson that Palestine knows what it means to be shot for your ethnicity. And you can see his sign there. And so that led to this hashtag that we saw several people using, Ferguson Solidarity, Palestine to Ferguson. This is a tweet from Miriam who says, always make sure to run against the wind, to keep calm when you're tear gas. The pain will pass. Don't rub your eyes. So that's from a Palestinian. On the other hand, someone in Ferguson took that advice. This is Janetta. She says, milk really does work for tear gas. Thank you, Palestine, for the tip. So you see this solidarity here because people recognize a struggle, even if it's not their own struggle. Reverend, what did that solidarity mean to you?
The connection between Palestine and Ferguson became very important in this struggle. You were able to see in real time the benefit that we now have through all of cyberspace to be a small world, even though we are a large world. And when young people in Palestine began reaching out to young people in Ferguson with advice, there was a connection made that exists throughout this day. So ironically, many of those young people who were being tweeted those messages have now visited Palestine. They see the connections between oppression there and oppression here, recognizing the propensity of humanity to always find someone else to other. And they have created a form of solidarity that says, until we're all free, then none of us are free. I find it to be very encouraging, actually, that we're finally able to start to get on the same page and recognize the intersectionality that is present in all of these oppressive measures.
Felix, you work and research the Horn of Africa, and there are many issues with protests and also the public working with the government or not working with the government. Does what you're hearing, does that resonate for the Horn of Africa too?
It certainly does. I mean, one of the big concerns that we've seen since November in Oromia, which is Ethiopia's largest region, is that there's been widespread protests across that region, over 500 protests, and the vast majority of those protesters have been peaceful. Security forces have met those protests with just lethal force. We believe over 400 people have been killed. Many thousands have been detained. And one of the things that I constantly hear from the protesters is that there's, they feel that they're alone in this struggle, that there's no one ever expresses concern over the abuses. The international community is silent, largely because they're very closely aligned with Ethiopia. And there's just no accountability. They know that nobody will ever hold those security officials to account. So I think when there are situations where other protesters show support in different contexts, that means a lot to people. I mean, I remember in January, for example, the European Parliament passed a very strong resolution on Ethiopia, and I was in an Oromo community at the time. And people were crying. I mean, this was the first time that they had actually seen that somebody was hearing their voices and that were showing some form of solidarity and sending the message that it's not okay to be shooting peaceful protesters in the streets.
You know, you raised a question there that's the same one that our community raised. And so I'll pass this to you, President Carter. Tam says, what kind of measures can be taken to make sure the Ethiopian government will compensate for innocent lives taken and be held accountable? What kinds of things can average everyday people or civil society do to help pressure governments in that direction? President?
Well, there's no doubt that the abandonment of the basic commitment to human rights by all the major parties that lead the world today has an adverse impact in a country like Ethiopia. We condemn any sort of human rights violations. It seems to me that the people in Oromia, which I think is the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia, should have an equal right to speak out and become involved in peaceful demonstrations without the government being punitive toward them and preventing their basic right of freedom of speech. The Carter Center doesn't concentrate on individual countries in our present session, we have many things going on in Ethiopia now. One of the things that we do in working it harmoniously with the government is to promote good health care. For instance, we only have one case left of guinea worm in all of the country of Ethiopia now, with about 82 million people. And in one 5-day session recently, we treated 9.4 million Ethiopians for trachoma, which is the #1 cause of preventable blindness. These are the kind of things we do.
Explain that link then, President Carter, between healthcare and helping a developing country with their healthcare, and how does that link to a reduction in violence, more accessibility to the voting process, how they're governed? Is there a connection between those two?
Well, I think there's a direct connection, not particularly between voting and good health care, but as far as human rights is concerned, which is what we're addressing, a basic human right of a person is to live in peace, but also to have a decent home in which to live, and to have adequate health care, and to have food for your children. So these kinds of things are basic human rights, just like freedom of speech and freedom of religion. So all of human rights factors come under one basic umbrella. And so the whole gamut of human rights, all the way from peace to a right to assemble peacefully, is part of human rights.
Felix?
I mean, I don't disagree with that, but I think one thing that is constantly a challenge in moving forward on Ethiopia's human rights situation is that a lot of Ethiopia's partners talk about the successes in health, or talk about the successes in education, and that's all fine, but that prevents those donors or those organizations from speaking more openly about the type of abuses that we're seeing today in Oromia. I mean, when it comes to healthcare in Oromia, for example, there were a number of individuals, protesters who had bullet wounds, who had broken limbs, who were denied treatment because security forces were telling health officials not to treat injured protesters. I mean, more broadly speaking, the broader context in Ethiopia, there is no way for the peaceful expression of dissent. So there's very little in the way of independent civil society, very little in the way of independent media. There's no political space. The ruling party owns 100 or has 100% of the seats in the federal and regional parliaments. And
So
the courts are not remotely independent.
Felix, these are massive challenges. How do you go about addressing that? Because it's not just about throwing up the challenges and how difficult the idea of reducing violence, stopping violence around the world, but actually, how do you do it?
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, that's a very big question. But I think one thing that we want to see is we want to see the international community just stopping the silence when it comes to countries like Ethiopia. Yes, they're making progress on health and other development indicators and a viable security partner. But it really does matter that the international community condemn these sorts of brutal crackdowns. I mean, Ethiopia acts with complete impunity internationally as a country. Let me just share something
with our international audience here. The Human Rights Report here, such a brutal crackdown, killings and arrests in response to Ethiopia's Oromo arrest. Let me just show you the pushback, though, that came from a government spokesperson. So Human Rights Watch is saying about 400 people killed in Ethiopia protests. The government is disputing those figures, saying at least half as many as you are saying. And they also say that we believe in many parts of Oromia where the protests were quite common, security forces conducted themselves in a very professional and responsible manner. It's really important that I bring this into the conversation because we don't have anybody from the Ethiopian government to be able to have that debate with you. Let me just push on a little bit though. Malika.
Well, we heard about some of the challenges that protesters in Ethiopia face. Here's some that people in Bahrain say they face. This is Sayed. He says, we understand that the situation in Bahrain is influenced by regional factors. So that's one challenge. Another person writes in, Marty, says, a big part of it is the UK and the US supply the means of repression and violence, she says, to Bahrain authorities, and then they turn a blind eye to abuses. So Ali, if you agree with those two tweets as those being some of the challenges, how then do you help combat them?
Well, I don't agree. I strongly agree because I've myself been victim of torture, and when I reported to the court, nothing happened. And also recently,
so Ali, what happened? Ali, what happened to you? You can't just say you were tortured and then move on. Tell us the circumstances.
I've been arrested in September 2010, and I've been subjected to torture and forced to sign a confession that I didn't read it. and I was put in for 2 months in solidarity confinement. I didn't have any contact with my lawyers or with my family or even phone call. And when the first hearing session in the court, I've been there, I documented this allegation or my allegation of being a victim of torture, me and other 21 person in that court. We all reported to the judge and nothing happened to that. And because of that, we have 5 martyrs dead in 2011 when the crackdown and the Saudi invaded Bahrain, died under custody, and it's been documented by Bassiouni, the committee that the king himself appointed to do an investigation, and he is an American, and nothing happened. No one put in an accountability for those who died in custody because of
Ali,
torture.
let me just share this with President Carter here. I'm not asking you, President Carter, to speak to a specific situation, but when we're talking about accountability and we're talking about a ruling government or ruling authorities, what do you do in that situation where torture, where harassment is happening? How do you address that? Bahrain is just one of many places around the world where that's happening.
One of the things that we are recommending very strongly in this session now at the Carter Center is that the United States and other major powers who are donors to these countries should not give any assistance, financial assistance or military assistance to a country that's guilty of basic human rights violations and oppression of their own people. That should be done.
That's huge, President Carter. Can you imagine what would happen around the world if that actually, if that idea actually resonated around the world? That would be huge. That would be a massive change.
Well, a lot of things we're recommending will be huge when they're implemented.
Yeah.
But we specifically have discussed the abuse of people, say, in Egypt, and also, say, in Honduras, and other countries as well, where violent oppression exists among governments against their own people, and still the United States is very flexible in still giving them assistance of financial affairs and also military. And we don't think the United States or any other countries should do that. We should hold them accountable for basic human rights violations and punish them by withholding aid which they demand and request.
Flexible is an interesting word. Malika.
I just wanna remark that, Mr. President, that I've been tortured with an American made tools, and my people being killed with an American arms or weapons made in America. We've documented this. We posted the picture of tear gas and this. And believe it or not, Mr. President, last year the administration, the United States administration, abandoned or they allowed to sell more weapons to Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. And this weapon will be used to kill its own people. You've just said in the beginning that those governments believe that they can torture their people without anybody can ask them or make any pressure on them.
Ali, allow the President to respond because we're in the last 1 minute of our show, and I would like to hear that answer. And you remember that President Carter is the 39th President of the United States, not the current President of the United States. Mr. President.
That's true. Don't have any authority now, but I think what I've just said to you is that we agree with you, and that this assistance given to abusive governments should be terminated by the United States and other major donors. That should be a requirement, that human rights be honored throughout the world, not just in our own country and those few that we've mentioned today. And we also, if we had a commitment to peace and human rights, just think how much different the world would be. It's a major request and a major demand on the part of a small group like the Carter Center, but we stand behind what we say, and we're going to give our opinion to the leaders of the major countries in the world.
However unpopular it may be, Malika.
Ending thought from Aliza, who says if only governments were held accountable, then people wouldn't be violated. Makes it sound pretty easy.
And you can see what the Human Rights Defender Forum at the Carter Center has been up to by checking out this website, cartercenter.org. Thank you very much, President Carter, and also to Reverend Blackman, Felix Horn, and Ali Abdul Imam. It's been a pleasure having you on the stream, Mr. President. Until next year, fingers crossed. Thanks for watching, everybody. Take care.